Character inspiration is an interesting subject, and many authors, I'm sure, have been asked how much of themselves they put into their characters. So I thought today I would talk a little bit about Allison Manning, the female main character from Haunt season, which is going to be available this coming Friday, June 26, 2026. Allison Manning is not directly inspired by me. And I will say that I did put a little bit of what I have been experiencing into her story, but her responses to the way things are happening are much different than I would have responded. Now, Allison Manning is in a long-term relationship. She and her husband have been married for almost 50 years. Over the course of their marriage, she has lost a lot of her hearing. The inspiration of that came from my husband, who did lose his hearing throughout our marriage, and he got cochlear implants a few years ago. So Allison also has cochlear implants, and that does play into the story, but I don't want to talk about that in too much detail because it may give away spoilers. So I will say that Allison recently had the cochlear implant surgery. So they are wondering if some of what has happened to her is related to that surgery. And there may be some mood swings that are related to that surgery. The other thing that Allison is dealing with as a woman in her 70s is postmenopause. Now, I can only talk about menopause as it has applied to me because I really didn't notice a lot of perimenopausal symptoms before I went through the change. And it was a very smooth transition to postmenopause. So I assumed that that would continue to be the case. However, probably more than a decade after I went through menopause, I did start having what a lot of people consider perimenopausal symptoms. So things like hot flashes and the racing heart and the anxiety, all of that has happened to me later than I expected. So Allison in her 70s is having similar experiences. And part of the reason I did that was I grew up in a generation where we didn't really discuss those things. My kids are very open about what they're going through, what kind of research they've done. They've talked to their doctor. They're very proactive about their health. But I believe many people in my generation are more used to just dealing with whatever happens and moving on. So I gave that kind of thought process to Allison. She is an older woman. She's going through these things. She doesn't really want to talk about them. She just tries to get through them. So she's dealing with recent surgery. She's dealing with symptoms of menopause. And then something else starts happening. And they're not sure if it is a supernatural or paranormal event, which really means something outside of the normal, obviously. It doesn't necessarily have to be something like a ghost or a spirit, but since she has been hanging out with a group of people who are paranormal investigators, they do start to question whether something might be happening that is spurring her recent mood changes. So I wrapped all of those things up into Allison Manning, and she is going through a lot. She and her husband, as I mentioned, have been married for a long time. They're about to celebrate their golden wedding anniversary. So a few years more than my husband and I, since we just celebrated our 44th wedding anniversary. And as I'm sure may happen in many long-term marriages, the relationship becomes more companionable. And in their case, it becomes more like a caregiver and a patient because her husband, David, has gotten so used to taking care of her as she has lost her hearing. I based some of that on the experiences that I had with my own husband as he was losing his hearing, and just kind of speaking up for him in public, which I do still do on occasion because the cochlear implants are not perfect. He is more willing to let people know that he is hearing impaired. But for a long period of time, he actually withdrew into himself, and I would just be our conversationalist because he would wander off. So that's some of the impetus. I'm not saying that Allison did that in the book, but David became her ears, so to speak, over the course of her losing her hearing. So he has become a very supportive caregiver to her. And since she has recently had surgery, he is very overprotective of her because he's afraid. He's been watching out for any complications she might have had, and he's very conscientious about that. Now, the reason I gave Allison the hearing impairment and not David is that we often see relationships where the wife is the caregiver, the primary caregiver. So I thought it would be fun to switch it up and have the husband be in that situation. And that informs David's character. And Allison's mood changes make her a little cranky with her husband. She starts becoming annoyed at the way he keeps watching out for her. And she gets annoyed about all kinds of other things. There are some issues with jealousy. And they are wondering how much of this is natural to her and how much of it is a result of all of the recent things that have been happening to her. So basically, the inspiration for my character of Allison Manning is that she is a woman who's about a decade older than I am, so in her early 70s. She has been long married like I have. She's dealing with a lot of the physical symptoms that I have been dealing with recently. And as for the paranormal aspects of the book, I have had experiences in the past that I could not explain. For example, when my husband and I lived in Nebraska, we lived on a base, Offutt Air Force Base. We lived in base housing, so we were directly on the base, literally right across the street from the flight line. And at one point, when they were still doing the regular shuttle program, they were flying the shuttle cross country, and they stopped to refuel at Offutt. So we were able to actually see the space shuttle piggybacked on the 747 that was carrying it just from our bedroom windows. So that's how close we were to the flight line. And Offutt Air Force Base started out as Fort Crook. So it was a historic base, and it had been there for quite some time by the time we lived there in the 1980s. And I will say that the houses that we lived in at that time are no longer there because my husband drove through a few years ago and they had torn down all of that housing, which is a shame. But the houses we were in were fourplexes, I believe, and they were two-story. They would have 2 or 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms. They were meant for military families. And they have different housing options for different types of military personnel. So officers housing versus enlisted housing. And then there was single housing versus family housing. So we got the enlisted family housing. And as I said, it was old, it was historic. I think the housing that we lived in dated back to at least the 1940s. So it was probably around 40-ish years old. And my husband worked rotating shifts. So he would have something like 3 day shifts, and then he would be off for a couple of days. And then he would work 3 swing shifts. So, for example, 3 to midnight, and then be off for a couple of days. And then he would work 3 mid shifts, was something like midnight to 8 a.m., and then have a couple of days off. So his sleep was always just all over the place. And I would do my best to keep the kids as quiet as possible without, telling them to just sit down and be quiet. So I would try to keep them out of the house. We'd be out doing things. But in the evenings, sometimes we would be watching television together until they fell asleep, just so they would be a little bit quieter and not disturb their father while he was trying to rest. And one night we had only 2 kids at the time. And with our younger child, I was sitting there trying to get her to sleep. And I was watching a TV show, and we had the front door open to the living room. And then it also had the staircase to the upstairs right by the front door. So I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, which was facing the front door, and we had a stand with our TV. So I was watching the TV, and then I saw something out of the corner of my eye. And at this point, my daughter had fallen asleep, and I had her laying on the sofa next to me just so that she would feel that I was still there and I hadn't, left her in her crib, which would sometimes wake her up and upset her. So sitting there just relaxing and see the movement out of the corner of my eye, and I shift my gaze over, and where the corner where the front door and the wall meet, there was a shadow. And it looked like a man about 6 feet tall. So my husband is 6'5", and I thought maybe he was at the top of the stairs. And so I didn't hear anything. The floors did creak. They were old wood floors, and I didn't hear anything, and the shadow didn't move. So I was just quiet for a few minutes and sat there and waited, and the shadow just remained in place. And the longer that I looked at the shadow, the more I realized that the outline looked like a tall man, but he was wearing a hat and what looked like an overcoat or a greatcoat or something like that. So it was a very vague outline, but you could make out just enough detail to see that they were wearing a hat and a coat of some kind. And I started to get the chill up and down my spine. And my breath hitched, how when you get really nervous and it's, and I was trying not to make any noise to wake up my daughter, and the TV was going low in the background. And I just kind of closed my eyes for a second, took a breath, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. So I don't remember if I ever saw that shadow again. And my husband verified that he was not up at all that night because he was so tired. And I was terrified to actually go upstairs because that would mean walking past where the shadow had been. So I stayed up a lot longer than I should have because my older child was upstairs sleeping. My younger child was next to me. I needed to get, my younger child up to bed and get myself to bed at the same time. But it took me quite a while because I was so afraid to walk through that spot. And eventually I started to call the shadow Harry for some reason. I think it may have been related to a character on one of the TV shows I was watching. And I just kind of wrote him off as a spirit who had just paid a brief visit. Maybe somebody who had been stationed at Fort Crook. Maybe he was wearing a cavalry outfit. I don't know. So that was one experience that I had. Another one I had was later on when we were living in a house here in Carson City on the west side of town. And it was an older house, not quite as old as the one we had been living in Nebraska. It was from maybe the 1960s. Very nice old brick house. And in that house, we had a laundry room that was in between the kitchen and the front door. And it was a really nice spot to have the laundry room because on the other side of the front door was actually the primary bedroom, or what we were using as the primary bedroom. So it was very convenient. And one day I was in there, and it had no door to the kitchen, but it did have a door that closed because the front foyer area used to actually be an open front porch. And then they had enclosed it and added on to the house to make that bedroom that was over there. So I was in there, I was moving clothes from the washer to the dryer, and I heard what sounded like a man's voice behind me saying, "No." At the time, I was home alone. My husband was at work, my kids were at school, and I had just been puttering around the house doing some chores. So I knew there was nobody in the house, and I thought, well, maybe somebody is out in the yard because we did have windows. The windows were not open. And at that point, we were renting. So our landlord did have a yard service come and work on our grass. So I thought maybe it was our gardener. But I looked outside and there was nobody there. But I had very, very clearly heard a male voice say, "No." And one of my kids in the same house in the next room, so the kitchen area, would often go in there and say that she smelled chocolate chip cookies baking. And I very rarely baked chocolate chip cookies because it would get very hot in that kitchen. So those were a couple of experiences that we had there that were a little unnerving. And then my third really memorable experience, and actually I think it was two separate experiences. In the 1980s, would be when my grandmother passed away. So my father's mother passed away. I had a dream, or I suspected it was a dream, where she sat on the edge of my bed and was chatting with me and told me that everything would be okay. And obviously, I was upset when I lost my grandmother, but after that, I felt a sense of peace come over me. And I had a similar experience when my cousin, who was only a year older than I was, he was killed in a tragic auto accident. And he came to me one night and sat on the edge of my bed and also told me that everything would be okay. And I'm not sure if it's related to that, but there was another night when I was sleeping and it felt as though somebody were brushing my hair off of my brow. And it wasn't my husband because he was snoring next to me. So over the years, I have had a series of experiences that I cannot completely explain away. It depends on a person's beliefs as to whether or not they think that something supernatural happened or whether maybe some of these things were in my subconscious. Because, for example, the shadow figure, I do remember I was watching a TV show. It could have been something that was just cast by the light of the TV or something along those lines. It might not have been a shadow of a person. It might have been a street light. There are so many different ways to explain away some of these experiences that's really hard to prove whether or not they really happened. But I do have very strong memories of having had those experiences. Now, in the book, Allison and her husband don't really believe strongly in the supernatural, the paranormal, and they agree to, or actually, it's David's idea that they film a web series called Haunt Season. And part of the reason they're doing this is that they want to try to attract the interest of their younger grandchildren who are fixated on web shows on, a platform, something like YouTube, where they just continue watching these things. And it's funny, when I was visiting my kids and grandkids the other day, my younger grandchild was watching a ghost hunting type of show. So it does happen. There are periods of time when kids become obsessed with certain subject matter, like dinosaurs or like the supernatural. So they are hoping to attract the attention of their younger grandchildren by posting these episodes. They're also hoping to help their older grandson, who may be out of a job soon, and he's considering the idea of becoming a director. So if he is able to film and edit and post these videos for them, that may help him get work in the future. So they're doing it for many family reasons, and they obviously chose to do a supernatural type of show because the grandkids are obviously focused on that subject matter at that point in time. They also end up meeting with the Beyond Investigations team, who we see in Passion Restored, which is the first book in the series. So the Beyond Investigations team shows up again in Haunt Season, and they are in the book quite a bit. So a lot of the characters that were met in the first book come back in the second book, and they are obviously paranormal researchers because they have a belief that there is something else going on beyond what we can perceive. So with all of this going on, Allison's issues, it does make for, I think, a very interesting story. So those were my inspirations for mainly Allison's character, but a little bit about what's going on around Allison as well. And I'm just going to take a moment to read you a few paragraphs from the book. It doesn't give away too much of the story, but it does give you a little bit of an idea about Allison and her interactions with the Beyond Investigations team. "Come on in," Allie said, stepping aside. "I really appreciate you making the trip down. Traffic can be pretty rough." She closed the door behind the two women as they stepped into the foyer. "This is a little embarrassing, but I didn't know where else to turn." "I'm glad you called." Larea pulled her into a comforting hug before taking a moment to examine Allie's face. "You look tired." Allie gave a weary smile. "Not a great night." "Krista called to tell me what happened," Larea said. "I hope you don't mind that I looped Angela in on the discussion." Angela patted Allie's shoulder. "Moran's the name, research is my game." Lorea's eyes sparkled with mischief. Wouldn't that be Samson now? You can't have forgotten the gorgeous hunk of man you married already. Ooh, I'm telling Sage. The light banter helped ease Allie's self-consciousness. Now, girls, she said with a genuine laugh. Okay, that's funny. So I am in my upstairs office and I do have all the windows open. And obviously, I'm talking about paranormal types of situations. So I have the door over here closed, but I do have the windows open in both rooms. So I'm sure I did not have the door secured all the way. And it just opened. I think we had a shift in the breeze, but now my hackles have risen. So I think that's a good place to end this video because this is how easily we can be spooked by something. And I can very easily explain what just happened, but to have it happen while I was filming myself reading this book is actually pretty funny. So maybe somebody is saying hello. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little bit of background on haunt season and the character of Allison Manning and a little bit about her husband and her family and what is going on with her throughout the course of the book. I hope I didn't give too much away, but I don't think I really spoiled any of the important plot points. And I hope that you will give the book a chance and, especially if you are an older person who is going through changes in your body that are just so inexplicable that they might as well be supernatural. It is a rough time. It's a little bit rougher than I expected because I assumed getting older would be more like going back to my teen or childhood years, whereas I didn't take into account the fact that my body is much older and more tired, and life is just not the same as it was back then. But I wrapped up all of those experiences into writing this book. I feel like it's a good book. I really think this is one of my better stories. I do hope that each book improves, of course, because that's the whole point, is that we're trying to get better at what we're doing. So I'm just a little unnerved right now. Anyway, thank you for joining me today. I hope you're having a wonderful day and week so far, and I will talk to you again tomorrow. I'm Cassidy Carson, and this is The Life of a Writer. Take care.